Yes.
Yes, it is.
So, good morning, everyone. This is a presentation, a webinar from the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo. Our coordinator and a lot of the graphics today are done by Terry Spataro. And I also wanted to put in a little extra plug for one of our regular attendees who couldn't come today, Bruce Lloyd, who did some AI work and support for me in collecting together lots of different information on various theories of consciousness. And the webinar today, webinar 7, is the Future Evolution of Consciousness, Module 7, and we'll be talking about theories of consciousness. This webinar series aligns with a book I'm doing on the future evolution of consciousness, and the chapters in the book that have been posted so far up on my website, and the webinar series is aligning with that. In fact, as I mentioned, up on the website are the set of chapters. The chapter that this webinar today is aligning with is the chapter on theories of consciousness, and those are the URLs. The URLs are in the outline too, so you don't have to worry about writing them down. Obviously, they're too long to write down right at the moment. But the chapters are up there on the website as well as the chapter for today. And as Terry also mentioned, the YouTube videos of all of the previous webinars in this series on the future evolution of consciousness are up on my YouTube channel, and announcements are made about them in my newsletter when they are available through the Future Consciousness Insights. Now, theories of consciousness is a big, broad, and diverse area of thinking and study that goes back thousands of years. And today I'm going to be doing part one. Part two will come later on. And this is an outline, probably what we'll get through for today, including the hard problem, materialism, idealism, dualism, the theory of intentionality, phenomenology, panpsychism, feminist theories of consciousness, the concept of emergence, relational theories of consciousness, naturalistic versus supernatural theories of consciousness, and probably we'll cover what's on this first slide today. But there's a second half. And the second half we will do in part two of the series, where we're going to talk about a variety of popular views, integrated information theory, global workspace theory, ideas about levels of consciousness, computational and information theories, mathematical theories, the relevance of psychic and altered states, the mystery of matter, mysterianism, which go look that up if you don't know what that means. I like the term, but that's in fact a theory of consciousness. And we're also going to look at what a science fiction has to offer through alien stories on consciousness and the future of consciousness. And then in particular, toward the end there, we're going to talk about robots and general AI, cyborgs, and virtual reality, and how those concepts, those themes apply to thinking about the nature of consciousness. Then there'll be a summary and comparison discussion at the end. We'll do discussion along the way. In case you want to see the discussion questions that I put together for the entire webinar, both parts of it, that's at the end of the outline, which Terry has put up on the chat box for today. So that's the big picture. Now, normally what I do is I do a very quick review of the previous webinar. And in the previous webinar, I introduced as a second principle for understanding consciousness the idea of reciprocity and talked about Eastern versus Western paradigms of consciousness. I talked about the Taoist yin yang as a model for understanding the concept of reciprocity. And then I got into discussing open systems, which is a beautiful example of reciprocity and how it's been applied to understanding life and humanity. I discussed the relationship of reciprocal and purposeful evolution. I spent a good deal of time on ecological psychology and how that is relevant to understanding consciousness. And I compared reciprocity and dualism and how reciprocity informs the whole issue of knowledge, epistemology. And then I pulled it together with taking the ideas of reciprocity and evolution and applying them to time. So that was what I did in the previous webinar. And today I'm going to be focusing on various theories of consciousness, which, as I've mentioned, are incredibly diverse and rich in scope. Now, something I've done in the past, and I thought I just would continue it, people that are connected with the webinar series are continually publishing books. And Rob, in fact, who is here today, Rob Swigart, um, has published quite a few books, collections of stories having science fiction or historical aspects to them. And I put up one of his more noteworthy books, Mixed Harvest. But Rob has quite a number of books that he's published. Victor Madi, who periodically shows up at the webinars, has recently published a book on planetary foresight and ethics. And there's a good deal on consciousness and paradigms of consciousness, East and West, in Victor's book. And most recently, well, who I think is one of the sharpest, most knowledgeable individuals writing about life, the universe, and everything, Howard Bloom, just recently published a book called The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. Everything you knew about nature is wrong. And if you've never read Howard Bloom, I would highly recommend reading him. He writes fantastic and very engaging and intelligent and interesting books. And this is his most recent one. And Howard hasn't come to any of the webinars, but I've chatted with him at times about the webinars. And so he's definitely aware of them, and he definitely is a contributing factor, I believe, into supporting the webinar series. So I put his book up there. But I wanted to mention some other books now, too. These are specifically regarding consciousness. There are a number of different books that try to do overviews, try to provide big syntheses of understanding the nature of consciousness and different approaches to what consciousness is, et cetera, et cetera. One book that I have found, and it's gone through multiple editions now, Consciousness and Introduction by Susan Blackmore and Emily Trosianko. Trosianko. Um, that I think is a really good intro book to the diverse areas of thinking on the nature of consciousness, and I would highly recommend it. She did a follow-up conversations on consciousness where she talks to different leading theorists. In case you're not familiar, the University of Arizona does an annual Science of Consciousness conference, which is a very diverse group of people that meet sometimes down in Tucson, sometimes other places. And you can look at their website, and it's a great resource for the richness of thinking on consciousness. I've already mentioned in previous webinars, in fact, when I interviewed Leslie Combs, Robert Kuhn's A Landscape of Consciousness, toward a taxonomy of explanations and implications. And this is a great overview of theories of consciousness, but it is a massive overview. And it is entirely up on the internet, the web. You could download a copy of it. And it's, even though it's an article, it really is like a big book. And one that I just ran into, Theories of Consciousness, an introduction, is another one that I think would be a valuable book to look at to get a perspective on different theories of consciousness by Seeger. So those are general overviews. And by the way, I should mention before we start in here, one other thing is there are dozens upon dozens of physicalist, materialist theories of consciousness. Kuhn's article does a good, thorough, detailed job of looking at brain-based and biological, physical-based theories of consciousness. I'm not going to go into anywhere near the detail that he does in his article, but if you want to read more about various physical materialistic theories, go look at Kuhn's article. There's a huge chunk of it that deals with brain-based materialistic physical theories of consciousness. So those are some good additional resources besides my own chapter, which I have up there on theories of consciousness. Now, the place I'm going to begin here is with a very famous quote from the 20th century philosopher, one of the great 20th century philosophers by sure, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And this is out of his book, The Tractatus. There are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. And that perhaps, just perhaps, is a way to describe consciousness and our sense of it. Perhaps we can't put into words. Perhaps it's just something that's made manifest to us. And we will get to that. But I thought it was a good place to begin to highlight the fact that even though there are hundreds and hundreds of theories of consciousness, lots of people will say consciousness is fundamentally some deep, profound, philosophical, ontological mystery. What it is, why it is, how does it connect with the physical world? Now, if that might sound abstract and philosophical, one conclusion I've come to, and it just gets reinforced the more I look at theories of consciousness, is that the particular theory of consciousness that you assume what consciousness is, its nature, those theories, or the theories that you adopt, have definite implications and different ones, depending on the theory you adopt, regarding how you foresee the future of consciousness. That is, depending on the theory you have, there's different implications as to where you think consciousness is heading in the future. And so the relevance in looking at theories of consciousness is that they have great implications and diverse implications regarding the theory you adopt about where consciousness is heading in the future. Now, the challenge that we face, which is a very fascinating challenge, is that we need to use our consciousness self-reflectively to try to understand what the nature of our consciousness is. It's as if we need to hold the mirror, and that mirror being consciousness itself, up to itself to try to understand what it is. But we're using the very phenomena, the very power, to try to understand itself. So this is a self-reflective process that humans have gotten into, where given that we are conscious beings, we are attempting as conscious beings to understand consciousness. Now, some people would say that consciousness is, in fact, a brute fact and a mystery, and it can't be explained. But it's the core of our existence. Now, I would just simply point out to everyone who's here listening that right now, your the totality of your lived existence is consciousness. That is what you are participating, immersed in right at this point in time, in listening to me, sitting in your chair, aware of the chair. And it is with this capacity, this phenomena of consciousness, and through it, that we understand reality. Our understanding of reality is a particular dimension of consciousness. And who we think we are, our personal identity, our self, is a conscious reality. The me you feel, the I you feel, that is you. And it is through consciousness that we shape and create the world around us. Through purposeful evolution, I would suggest. And consciousness has certain interesting qualities to it. Among them, you could transcend time with consciousness. That is, you can remember the past and speculate on the future. And you could transcend the actual through fiction and imagination. You can imagine things that don't really exist at all. You can engage in abstraction, which is to come up with general ideas which transcend the world of particulars that you perceive consciously through the senses. And there's a huge diversity of different conscious states, different activities, and different kinds of objects of consciousness, from thoughts, emotions, perceptions, memories. That is, consciousness is a very complex and rich reality. And as a final point in thinking about this, and this is, in my mind, very fascinating, consciousness is part of the fabric of existence, but it illuminates and apprehends existence. That is, it somehow reflects back upon the very nature of existence and illuminates what it is. But it is part of existence. It is part of the reality in which we are in. And that's a loop that I find very interesting and fascinating that I got into last time. So those are a few just intro remarks on looking at the phenomena of consciousness and theories of it. Now, a place that people often start from when they begin discussing consciousness and theories of consciousness is what has been referred to as the hard problem. And the hard problem of consciousness involves a particular way of conceptualizing consciousness and physical reality. And in particular, the hard problem states that consciousness and physical reality are incommensurable and qualitatively different realities. So, physical objects are in some fundamental way different than thoughts and feelings. They are qualitatively different. Now, the person who is usually identified as the modern starting point for formulating this duality of incommensurable realities is René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher, which Descartes, in fact, first articulated in his book Meditations on First Philosophy. And Descartes, when he looked at consciousness, saw consciousness as a non-spatial thinking soul somehow connected with a deterministic, spatially structured physical machine, the body. And in fact, in general, Descartes saw consciousness, and he also used the word mind, as incommensurably different from physical reality. So the puzzle emerges, how can physical reality, which is one kind of thing, and consciousness, which is a totally different kind of thing, possibly be connected together? How could we explain that? And that incompatibility, that perceived incompatibility that Descartes saw between consciousness and the physical realm is what people refer to as the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness has repeatedly been a problem that people have tried to solve, dissolve, figure out, and it sticks with us to today. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people who've come up with ways to respond to it, but it sort of sticks with us. How is it that a physical brain, one kind of thing, can generate a feeling of love or a memory of your first date? How could that happen? Because those seem to be totally different kinds of realities. David Chalmers, who was one of the best known contemporary philosophers of consciousness and mind, and a very active participant in the Science of Consciousness conferences, back in the 90s wrote a book called The Conscious Mind, in which he attempted to clearly formulate this, what he saw as the hard problem of consciousness. And one of Chalmers' arguments, which is called the zombie argument, is that I can imagine a being that I'm looking at right now, hypothetically, who is behaving and acting just like a normal human being, but on the inside, they're not having any experience at all. They're, in a sense, a zombie. And the reason why he brings up this possibility of imagination is he wants to point out that there's something above and beyond all of the behaviors, however intelligent they are, that people manifest, and an extra something which is going on experientially within them. And that what is going on experientially within them is consciousness. And consciousness is something above and beyond all of the complex behaviors that we show and that other people could see us engaging in. And he refers to all of the qualities of consciousness that we experience, from colors and smells and emotions and feelings and sensations and thoughts, the qualia of consciousness. And this is something beyond the physical body, beyond the physical brain. It's something that somehow transcends that. But how do we understand the relationship between the two? Some people have also framed the hard problem as the incommensurability between a first person perspective on reality and a third person perspective on reality. Like right now, I'm having, as you are also having, each of you, a first person perspective on reality. You're seeing the world and hearing the world around you, smelling it, tasting it, having thoughts and feelings going on. But that's from your personal point of view. You could also look at another person separate from you and see them as an individual out there in the world. And that would be to look at a human from a third person perspective. I see myself from a first person perspective. I see you as a third person perspective. How is indeed possible to combine together these two different modes of understanding the nature of a human, a conscious human, one from the first person perspective, one from the third person perspective. Now, I'll come back to that one, but and that's often used as another way to formulate the hard problem of consciousness. But if you recall from last time, I discussed Gibson's notion that consciousness fundamentally has two poles, one which is self-awareness, proprioception, and the other which is other awareness, the outside, which is perception. Those two, that distinction in Gibson corresponds with this distinction here between third person versus first person perspectives. And it's often seen as a insurmountable problem. How do the two connect together? So that's the hard problem. Now, different people have attempted to try to solve it or figure it out. And the place I'm going to begin on theories of consciousness is with materialism or physicalism. I have a quote here from Patricia Churchland, who is a neurophysiologist and been very active in the study of consciousness. And the quote is, "Everything we feel and think stems not from an immaterial spirit, but from electrical and chemical activity in our brains." And that's a nice, succinct statement of materialism. Now, materialism often gets a bad name, especially in contemporary times, that we are more than just physical bodies, blah, 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 and there's something extra to us, this consciousness, or this spirit, even, people would say. But we shouldn't sell materialism short because there's lots of reasons to believe in it, and it is a very well developed and has been exceedingly so for a long, long time as a perspective on consciousness. Now, materialism basically is this: the universe is entirely physical. A complete explanation of consciousness can be achieved through understanding the brain and the body. And Robert Kuhn would say that this is the dominant view of most scientists, that we can understand consciousness simply through understanding our physicality. That's all we need. There's nothing beyond our physicality. And Churchland is an advocate of this position. And there's probably her most famous book, Neurophilosophy, Toward a Unified Science of the Mind Brain. Um, And Churchland takes the view that we will understand the entire nature of consciousness through the advancements of neuroscience. She advocates for what's referred to as ontological reductionism, which basically says there is nothing non-physical in reality. She rejects dualism, that there's a second substance or phenomena. There's one phenomena, which is physicality. And consciousness is a feature of complex brain processes. Now, even if lots of people have trouble with extreme materialism, there is an immense amount of evidence that what is going on in our brains is very tightly, specifically connected with multiple dimensions of our consciousness. In that you can identify areas and particular small units in there of the brain which produce various kinds of sensations, thoughts. When you damage an area, you could predict what features of consciousness will disappear. All of neuroscience and neurology is based on this notion that our conscious processes connect with specific functionings in different parts of our nervous system. And Churchland also advocates for what's called eliminative materialism, which is the view that our concepts that we have in describing consciousness will eventually be replaced by neurological concepts. In her mind, our personal self is a creation of our brain. Consciousness evolved to enhance our survival. She's very skeptical of philosophical introspective approaches to consciousness. And she feels that we should just focus on understanding the brain and that consciousness is not a mystery. It's simply processes in the brain. And again, to repeat, there is an immense amount of evidence showing connections, very precise connections between different processes in the brain and what people report or don't report in their conscious experiences. Now, on your outline, I have a YouTube from a philosopher, a contemporary philosopher, Galen Strawson, who I'm going to talk about repeatedly throughout this webinar and the next one, on the notion that somehow consciousness is an illusion. And he's a critic of this idea. But the materialists often end up sounding as if the fact that we believe we're conscious is some kind of an illusion, and that all that really exists is physicality. So if you have a chance, it's a nice interview where he critiques this notion that everything is simply physical, and that when we say consciousness is nothing but brain activity, it almost sounds like we're saying consciousness is an illusion and that it's all really just activity in our brain. But there's all different forms materialism can take. In the 20th century, a very popular materialistic view developed in psychology and in philosophy called behaviorism. Behaviorism was an approach to psychology where psychologists don't talk about any hypothetical mind or consciousness and simply try to study behavior. The concept of consciousness is scientifically off limits. That's from Watson psychology from the standpoint of a behaviorist. This became a very popular view in psychology in the first few decades of the 20th century. Ontological behaviorism is the idea that all that really exists is behavior. There's no separate thing called consciousness. Logical behaviorism is another version of behaviorism, which was popularized by the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his very famous book, The Concept of Mind. And in that book, what he argues basically is that all of the terms we use to refer to aspects of the mind or properties of the mind are really just shorthand ways of describing patterns and dispositions of behavior. So behaviorism took different forms. But brain-based physical approaches also were emerging, developing, and they're worth starting to mention them aside from just simply Churchland to get a little more detail. And the one I wanted to begin with, which is was very popular and in some ways still is popular, was developed in the 19th century by the neurophysiologist Johannes Mueller. And basically, it was a localization theory of brain and consciousness, which means that different areas of the brain generate and are associated with different conscious qualia or experiences. So, for example, if you were to stimulate the back of the brain, the occipital lobes, the visual area, people will report seeing colors. If you stimulate the auditory cortex part of the brain, they'll report hearing sounds. If you stimulate the parietal area, the primary somathesis area, people will report feeling touches. That is, different qualities of consciousness are generated by specific areas in the brain. And this has been referred to as the localization theory of the brain and consciousness. And Mueller called it the specific energies of nerves theory. The problem we run into with this idea, even though when you do stimulate parts of the brain, people do report different kinds of experiences depending on which part of the brain you stimulate. When you look at the brain from the outside, the third person perspective, the neural tissue of the brain on the outside and down lower is basically all variations of the same kind of cellular structures. Why is it that neurons in one part of the brain generate colors, but in another part of the brain generate experience sounds? Because if you look at the brain at a cellular level, there doesn't seem to be any qualitative immense difference between the different parts of the brain that would produce totally different kinds of conscious experiences. Why is that? A more recent version of this idea of qualities and functions being tied to specific areas of the brain comes from Marvin Minsky, a very popular book that came out, 20, 30 years ago at least, The Society of Mind. And Minsky's idea is that consciousness or mind is really decomposable into a set of specific functional modules, which are lodged in different networks and areas of the brain. So consciousness really emerges from a set of more specific functions in different parts of the brain, which collectively come together as a society to form a unitary consciousness. And that's a slightly different version of the localization view. But there has been the opposite view in psychology regarding the brain, which is, I call it generally, the holistic electromagnetic field theories, because there's lots of different versions of this. And I'm just looking to see, yeah, I want to make sure I get it up there. Okay. Um, A noted psychologist by the name of Carl Lashley demonstrated rather fascinatingly that if you cut out different parts of the brain, it doesn't seem to have specific effects for specific functions. It looks as almost as if the entire brain is at work in the phenomena of mind and consciousness. Carl Pribram, who was inspired by Carl Lashley, developed what he called the holographic theory. And the holographic theory was that the brain is like a hologram, and the information that the brain stores is distributed over the entire brain, not specific in specific locations. So there's no specific spot where the memory of your grandmother is stored, or no specific spot where the experience of red is stored. Rather, it's somehow stored holographically across the entire brain. So instead of the brain being a set of specific parts, each doing specific functions, the brain is a holistic mechanism that works as a whole, and that our consciousness is due to this holistic, interactive field effect that emerges in the brain. Now, I must mention that this general idea has taken many, many different forms in contemporary neurology, neuroscience, philosophy. One of the best known or best examples of this is Edelman's neural Darwinism, which is that to begin with, the brain is born, the human brain is born with massive, intricate neural connections that, depending on our experiences, our behavior, these connections are whittled down, and certain connections are strengthened and others disappear. So we start off with this huge array of possible connections, which then whittles down through experience. They're selected out which ones stay, and that our consciousness emerges through a interactive set of feedback loops between our thalamus and our cortex. Now, the thalamus and the cortex are frequently implicated in theories of consciousness that are physiological. And Edelman is a good example of this idea. But as I mentioned, there's many other versions of this. But the main thing to pull away from Edelman and the whole holistic notion is that consciousness doesn't arise in some specific spot in the brain. Different qualities of consciousness don't arise in specific parts, but rather consciousness is connected with holistic field interactive effects in huge parts of the brain or the brain as a whole. So this is a different kind of physicalism, a different kind of brain-based view than the localization view. Daniel Dennett is another very famous physicalist. His book Consciousness Explained attempts to describe how consciousness is not some kind of extra thing, but rather that the brain is a massive parallel processing device with multiple things going on simultaneously, and that we momentarily select for certain things going on and not other things. The brain is basically a pandemonium device, but there's no conscious stage above and beyond the brain. And this is a very famous book, which lots of people have commented on, positive and negative. And I read it, and it is an interesting book worth reading because it definitely has a physical approach, attempting to treat consciousness as not anything different than the brain. Another way, though, to be a physicalist and come at consciousness is to reject the notion that the brain is necessary for consciousness, that consciousness perhaps arises at a cellular level, that cells are conscious, individual living cells. And of course, people have argued perhaps plants are conscious. But the basic idea, and I have a link in the outline for this, is that you don't have to get to the level of complexity and integration of a brain to get consciousness. Consciousness is associated with much simpler forms of life, and in particular, cells. And cells individually show an awful lot of different aspects of intelligence and adaptability and complexity. And indeed, the cell may be the origin of consciousness as opposed to the nervous system or the brain. But again, we're still thinking physical here. Now, then there are a whole slew of quantum physics inspired theories of consciousness. The most famous being Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's quantum theory of consciousness, that in their view, the brain can be understood at a quantum level of activity, at a subatomic level of activity. And it is quantum effects in the brain that generate consciousness. And this view has gotten a lot of debate, a lot of controversy, a lot of no, it doesn't make any sense, et cetera, et cetera. But what they want to do is they don't want to locate consciousness in a particular area of the brain or set of networks of the brain. They want to locate the physical cause of consciousness down at the quantum level, and it's the quantum level that's generating consciousness. Now, people inspired by quantum physics have also brought up the idea that consciousness seems to be involved in the determination of physical reality itself. And so people have argued that quantum physics would seem to imply that um, consciousness cannot be somehow explained in terms of the physical because you need consciousness for the physical to be realized, in the sense that the only way you can get a measurement of the quantum level is with the intrusion of a measurer, a conscious measurer, into that determination. So quantum physics can be used as a physical explanation for consciousness, but quantum physics as a physical theory is also sometimes used as an argument for why consciousness is fundamental, and in fact, you need consciousness to get anything like an observable physical world. And people also will point out that quantum physics has an element of indeterminism in it, and this is the foundation for free will in conscious beings, because we exist in an indeterministic physical reality. Now let's flip it over. You could argue that everything that exists is physical. The converse would be to argue that everything that exists is consciousness. And so instead of denying the existence of consciousness and saying everything is physical, there have been a number of different people who have denied that there's anything like a physical reality independent of consciousness. And this view is idealism. There is no independent physical reality. The entire universe existence is all consciousness. Now, this does seem kind of counterintuitive, but this has been a very popular view, which has taken lots of different forms, and there's lots of reasons for arguing it. Basically, it's the idea that our conceptual understanding and our sensory experience are all consequences of consciousness, and that the physical world doesn't independently exist of consciousness. And this comes up in the East and it comes up in the West. Now, I first ran into probably the most famous Western idealist view of existence with the 18th century philosopher George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley. And Berkeley is very famous for the line, to be is to be perceived. And Berkeley argued, that the postulation of a world existing beyond our perceptions is meaningless. That is, when we say there's a physical reality beyond our perceptual experiences that all of you are having right now, Berkeley is going to say that you're assuming there's something beyond what you're experiencing right now, but this is a totally meaningless statement because everything that you know or you can know is reducible to your experiences. So Berkeley is an idealist in the sense that the totality of existence is simply experiences. But then he brings in the notion of mind. And he says you need minds to have ideas or experiences. And what about the forest when there's nobody there to observe it? Does it continue to exist? Well, in Berkeley's argument, yes, it continues to exist because it exists in the mind of God. So we have individual minds who are momentarily having experiences of the world, but if no one were having any of those experiences, the mind of God would be holding all of them, at least at that moment in time. So when we close our eyes, does the world disappear because we don't perceive it anymore? Berkeley's answer is no, it doesn't, because it still exists in the mind of God. Now, when I went through Berkeley decades and decades ago, I found his argument incredibly convincing. Because how can you argue with what can you know beyond what you experience? And if you can't assume that, and you can't assume there's anything beyond your experience, then everything is simply experiences. Except Berkeley postulates this notion of minds and a mind of God. And the idea that all that exists or that can be meaningfully understood are experiential phenomena is referred to as phenomenalism too, as well as idealism. But after Berkeley, we come to David Hume. And David Hume actually outdid Berkeley because David Hume said, well, what is this thing called mind? What is this thing called self? Those are simply inference as well, too. The only thing that you can really observe are sense impressions, color, sight, sounds, and ideas. But that's it. You don't observe anything else. So that's all there is. Now, this is an extreme version of phenomenalism. There's no mind in here. There's no God in here. There's no physical world in here. All there is a continual population and flow of sense impressions and ideas. This is kind of a really tight and parsimonious idealism or phenomenalism. So, in case you're saying, well, what happened to the brain in all of this? Well, the brain is something that you can observe in another person, but that indeed is an experience you're having. Or your brain, presumably, could be observed by another person, but that's simply an experience they're happening. So the brain is not the cause of consciousness because the brain is simply an observable within someone's consciousness. Now, we come to another version of idealism. These are all Western so far, note. And that's from Leibniz, the 18th century philosopher, one of the great minds in Western civilization. And Leibniz proposed that the universe in its totality is a extreme number of diverse individual monads or minds or pockets of experience. There's no physical world beyond it, but all of the monads, their individual experiences are all coordinated together with each other. So you as a monad, your experiences are coordinated together with my experiences. And who is doing the coordinating but God? God coordinates all of the monads. But each monad is a unique reflection of the whole. So my experience is from a particular perspective on the cosmos. Yours is from a different one. But all we end up with are these active individual conscious monads that all are coordinated together by the very big monad, which is God. Now, I'll introduce one other idea here on idealism, which will be a transition from West into East, and that's the notion of physical illusionism, which pops up in the West in Plato, that what we see around us, the physical world, are just illusions, and really what exists are eternal forms. And it pops up in the East with the concept of the veil of Maya, which is that the phenomenal world is all a illusion in the sense that it belies a more fundamental eternal world beyond it. Now, I've already been into this idea before when I talked about ontologies, the distinction between an eternal realm and a temporal realm, where the eternal realm is seen as more real, more fundamental, more permanent, and the perceptual realm, transitory, temporal, and not as real. Now, that comes up in both the East and it comes up in the West. And it gets associated with idealism in that idealists who take this point of view will simply argue that what you observe around you, this physical world that you think you see, is just simply an illusion. It's not fundamentally real. What is real is something behind the scenes, but it's not like you can't access it, but it's something eternal and different from the apparent world that you see perceptually or perceive perceptually. Now, let's sort of look at some Eastern ideas that align up with idealism. And here's a quote from a contemporary popular thinker, Deepak Chopra. And this is very Eastern, as I will explain in a little more detail. Pure consciousness is the underlying, unchanging, eternal essence of true self that is separate from the ever changing physical and mental realms. It is the observer or witness of all experience, but it itself is unaffected by experience. Now, I'll start off with a few very general ideas, and then we'll look at some specific theorists or thinkers about um, this basic concept of consciousness that comes out of the East. In Hindu philosophy, there is the popular view that everything in the universe is a manifestation of a universal, unified consciousness, literally the mind of God. Even though they'll use other words, not necessarily God, but basically what they believe is that all of this around us is simply manifestations of some unified cosmic consciousness. Now, in a way, this is similar to Bishop Berkeley, because Berkeley had his mind of God. Berkeley believed that God held all of the perceptual phenomena of reality in continued existence, even if no one was right then and there experiencing them. So there's some similarities with Berkeley, not entirely, but some similarities. But a second idea here is that this cosmic consciousness, this fundamental base to all of reality, fundamental to it, is totally undifferentiated. So consciousness is not this cosmic consciousness is not something of colors and thoughts or emotions or sounds, but rather is totally without any distinctions. It's um, all of one. And I came across this interesting angle on this from an Eastern thinker, the idea of pure intransitive consciousness, that to which everything else appears. So, right now, you're having lots of different experiences, lots of particular things going on. What is all of this appearing to? And the argument would be to this undifferentiated, unified cosmic consciousness. Now, Eastern thinkers actually will identify this ultimate ground of being, often called Brahman, with the singular I, the singular consciousness in each of us, the Atman Brahman identity thesis, that each of us contains within us the spark of Brahman. The universal consciousness is at the core, at the eye of each of us. Keeping in mind, again, that this universal consciousness is not something that appears, it's not an object of consciousness, it's it is the illuminating light of universal consciousness, which manifests in each of us individually. Now, Chopra, who I had the quote up there, um, Chopra pretty much identifies with this kind of way of thinking. Chopra believes that a fundamental existence is an all-pervasive, non-local, timeless, undifferentiated, and originating consciousness. In fact, in his mind, consciousness means the same thing as existence. Now, notice how similar that is to Bishop Berkeley. In Berkeley, it is to be, to exist, is to be perceived. That is, the only sense in which something exists is if it is experienced. Here, consciousness is the same as existence. The physical universe in Chopra's mind, including our bodies and brains, arises from this fundamental consciousness. And individual consciousnesses, which are limited and have a sense of separateness, which is an illusion, are creations of this cosmic universal consciousness. But our goal in life should be to realign ourselves with this universal consciousness. Now, I think this is very fundamental to lots of Eastern thinking, and it connects together the nature of consciousness with predictions and preferences regarding the future of consciousness, because the theory in general takes the view that the ultimate journey or goal of life is to reunite with the universal cosmic consciousness. Now, notice that has certain similarities to Western thinking, where the goal, if one is of a religious Christian persuasion or also Islamic persuasion, for the soul to merge back with or go back to the presence of God after having, as a finite mind, been created by that universal mind of God. So it's a return to the origin, a return of the many to the one as a general model, because fundamentally their argument is that what exists is consciousness, it's universal and cosmic. Each of our individual consciousnesses comes out of it, so does the physical world, and the ultimate goal is to go back to that origin. Now, this is basically the idea that we find in, I forgot to put up Atman and Brahman, I forgot to put up Chopra, and now I'm putting up Sri Aurobindo. Um, and the one, Sri Aurobindo on the bottom there is very famous yoga, philosophical thinker of the 20th century. And at this point, I'm going to tell you a little story about Sri Aurobindo. And the woman next to him is been referred to as the mother. And I ran into this a bit of trivia, or not trivia, because actually people think this is a fundamental, most important spiritual event in the history of mankind. Back a number of years ago, when I first started to read and read about Aurobindo, uh, Aurobindo had a partner who he called the mother. And they developed a great following around them. And they were into various yoga practices. And he believed in the notion of a universal, non qualified consciousness, the absolute, which is existence, consciousness, and bliss, taken as a unity. And him and the mother, through meditation, through yoga, have been attempting to reach out to what they called divine consciousness, the supramental, and bring it into the physical world, into our world. It is transcendent in a sense from it, but they wanted to bring it in. And the mother, as it turns out, had this conscious experience where she perceives herself in front of this golden door, and she sees herself as having this hammer or sledge and shattering the golden door and having this divine consciousness, supramental reality, enter into our reality around us. And this is very consistent with what they wanted to try to realize in the ongoing evolution of humanity. But that day, when she realized this experience of confronting this divine consciousness and bringing it down to earth, they ended up calling it the Golden Day. And the Golden Day was February 29th, 1956. That was the day this happened. And when I read that the first time, it took a second for it to click, but it hit me. My wife, Jeannie, was born on the Golden Day. She was born on February 29th, 1956. Okay. So perhaps Jeannie is some manifestation of divine or supramental consciousness. But be that as it may, okay, and it's always interesting to read about the experiences of these different individuals and what goes on in their lives. Um, Consciousness is a force. It creates and sustains the universe. It creates and sustains and manifests physical reality. It first involves into physical reality, and then it evolves through a series of stages of life, individual minds, and progressively toward reunification. There, I mentioned that idea before, with the universal consciousness through developmental stages, where the final goal is to realize a cosmically attuned consciousness with this universal consciousness. And Aurobindo brings up an interesting idea. I just wanted to throw it in here, is that consciousness is self-luminous in his mind. That is, consciousness illuminates its own nature. That is, when we self-reflect, we don't have to engage in some like a looking in the mirror because consciousness actually is conscious of consciousness in order to be conscious. Now, Aurobindo developed an elaborate, together with the mother, philosophy of how to implement his ideas to address the challenges and problems of human life. And he felt that this journey that we could go on of reuniting with cosmic consciousness, with the supramental, through yoga and meditation and various other practices, was the key direction we should take. And this would be something which will address and solve the problems of humanity today. And so I think that's a good place for me to stop and take a 5-minute break. Um, and we can.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, we just went over this first one on idealism with Chopra and Sri Aurobindo and cosmic consciousness and Atman and Brahman. And now we'll go to the next slide, continuing with idealism and beginning with Sarkar, who was another Indian philosopher. And I want to point out some commonalities. There's a couple of Sarkar's books up there and a picture of him. Several commonalities with Sri Aurobindo and with Deepak Chopra. Absolute reality is infinite, uncaused, unqualified, supreme consciousness. Now, it's not exactly the same words as Sri Aurobindo, but it's very close. Sakar identifies two fundamental dimensions or features that are always united together within supreme consciousness: the understanding, the cognitive, the purusha, and prakrita, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the creative power. So consciousness, supreme consciousness, or consciousness in general, both understands and does. And from that absolute reality of infinite uncaused consciousness, we get qualified supreme consciousness, a cosmic mind, which is inclusive of physical reality. So physical reality emerges out of the absolute infinite consciousness, and individual minds evolve, emerge out of that. And Sakar, as well as other uh, Indian Hindu thinkers, believed in reincarnation too. And he believed in a distinctive human desire toward happiness and peace, which in his mind will eventually lead to a merger with the non qualified supreme consciousness in a cosmic cycle. So I want to just point out, and Richard is here, and Richard has extensively studied, been immersed in Sakar. There are some very definite similarities between him and Sri Aurobindo, and similarities between him and other Indian and Hindu thinkers. And I'm going to have some more to say on Sri Aurobindo and Sakar as we move along when I get to evolution. But I also wanted to bring in three Western contemporary thinkers who are all idealists. First of all, Bernardo Kastrup, who believes that consciousness is fundamental and individual consciousness, as each of our own individual consciousness, is a dissociation or a fragment of the universal phenomenal consciousness. There's no God in this one, by the way, notice. But that each of our specific conscious uh, pockets, so to speak, is a fragment or dissociation off of the universal consciousness. So he has a universal underlying consciousness too. And the physical world is a manifestation of consciousness. And it's an extrinsic view of this universal consciousness. So when we perceive the physical world, what we're simply perceiving is an external view of this universal, pervasive consciousness that's fundamental to all of existence. A second Western idealist, Hoffman, starts from the argument that conscious perception is not veridical. When you compare what we perceive with the way it is measured through physics, they are not the same thing at all. And I've had this, we talked about this previously about whether or not our conscious perceptions really are of something real. In Hoffman's mind, consciousness is just an interface for survival. And in Hoffman, the universe is really made up out of conscious agents and experiences. So it's another idealist view. There is no physical world fundamentally. There are conscious agents, which sounds a little bit like monads here in Leibniz. And then we have finally, who I'm going to talk about several times here, another contemporary, very popular thinker, Ian McGilchrist from The Master and His Emissary, who believes that the physical world is an abstraction. It's not something directly encountered. And consciousness is not a thing, but a creative process. But conscious knowing is always immersive in this, in reality. So in McGilchrist's mind, physical reality is not what is fundamental. It's consciousness which is fundamental, but consciousness is an immersive activity as opposed to a thing or a substance. So these might sound like subtle little differences, but as we move along, we'll see that these have different implications, again, regarding where we think of consciousness going. I forgot to mention Bishop Berkeley, who was a theist and lived in the 17th century, 18th century, he believed that materialism was a great threat to humanity, and he wanted to disprove the existence of the material world because he thought that spirituality and a focus on consciousness was losing its hold on Western civilization. So Berkeley was not just simply an idealist, he was an anti-materialist, which lots of people today will argue is a fundamental problem with humanity as a whole, that we focus too much on the material world and not enough on the internal conscious spiritual realm, which is what Berkeley thought we should do. And Berkeley's way of undercutting materialism was, in essence, to prove that physical matter doesn't exist in and of itself. So that was his way of undercutting materialism and a materialistic way of life, to basically argue that you are basing your whole philosophy of life on something that doesn't even exist. Now, let's shift to the next main theory here, our main cluster of theories, dualism. Dualism postulates that there's two types of being or existence. These two types of being or existence may interact, but there's no convincing argument to explain how consciousness and the physical realm, if they're incommensurable and qualitatively different, could possibly interact with each other. Now, to make the point a little stronger, how does activity in a physical neuron cause the experience of sadness? That seems very strange. But in turn, how does a psychological desire cause muscles to move? The same problem, only in reverse. It's hard to understand how consciousness and the physical world could interact if you postulate that there's these two different kinds of reality. Substance dualism, which is the view of Descartes and Kuhn says is the default position of all Abrahamic religions, is the belief that there are indeed two different kinds of substances or realities, a conscious or spiritual realm and a physical material realm. And the distinctive differences between the mind and matter are that mind or consciousness is non-spatial, it's indivisible, possesses free will. Matter is spatial, divisible, and deterministic. So these are two different kinds of substances, which Descartes has trouble explaining, and people had trouble explaining. Although, according to Kuhn, lots of people assume this, that your body is different than your mind or your consciousness. They're two different things. One particular version of dualism is called property dualism. Property dualism is the idea that really there's only one substance, physical matter, but there's two sets of qualities, and that conscious qualities arise out of physical matter, but they are not the same thing as the qualities of physical matter. So they're ontologically distinct. So somehow you get a second substance or a second reality emerging out of a first reality that has totally different properties than the first reality, but I can't explain to you how the hell that happened. And interactive dualism was Descartes, where Descartes believed that they interact with each other, but when you think it through, it's very difficult to imagine how a conscious reality makes a physical reality move or affect it. How does a thought move a muscle? Now, let me introduce some variations on dualism or dualistic theories. This is an image of a very famous allegory, the allegory of the cave by Plato in The Republic, his book, The Republic. And let me just put him up there. Plato in The Republic presented the notion that actually we're like people chained inside of a cave. And in this cave, somebody has a light which is illuminating physical objects, and the shadows of those physical objects are falling on the walls of the cave. And in his mind, we mistake the shadows on the wall of the cave for the real reality, which is the objects that are casting the shadows. And this is a, distinction in Plato between the eternal realm, the realm of ideas, and the transitory realm, the world of perceived physical reality. Some people will describe Plato as an idealist because he thinks the eternal realm is fundamental and the transitory perceptual realm is illusory. Or you could see Plato as a dualist, thinking there's two different kinds of reality, one of which is mental and one of which is physical. So, but I'm putting him up here under dualism, but you could put him under idealism too. Now, at the top of this outline on this slide, I make a distinction between naturalistic versus supernatural dualism. Naturalistic dualism is that consciousness and physical matter are both qualities or aspects of nature, both of which can be studied scientifically, but they're different. Versus supernatural dualism is that consciousness is somehow distinct from the natural world and can't be studied scientifically. So this is a difference between, do I think even if consciousness is different from my physical body and physical nature, do I think it's part of nature? That's naturalistic dualism. Supernatural dualism, I think that my consciousness and maybe my soul, my spirit, that's different than my physical body, and that's not part of the natural world, and you can't study it scientifically. But even if you believe either of those two, you end up with ideas like consciousness may be transcendent to the body, but can causally influence the body. That's part of the hard problem. How is that possible? I'll give you a different version of dualism here, which is fascinating and may sound a little bit like Bishop Berkeley from the 18th century, very famous, influential philosopher Immanuel Kant, out of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant distinguished between phenomena and noumena. And in Kant's mind, phenomena is what we experience and we interpret in terms of our human categories of understanding. Phenomena is all we understand, but phenomena is interpreted and understood and experienced by us in human terms. We assume that beyond our experiences, there is the thing in itself, the noumena. But we can never experience the noumena because the noumena transcends our categories of understanding. It's beyond our experience. That is, we do have experiences of a world, and we assume there really is a world there independent of our experiences, but we can never know it. Now, Berkeley's response to that would be, what the hell are you talking about with this noumena? Since you can't understand it, you can't experience it directly, why even postulate it? Kant, though, believed there was a thing in itself, above and beyond our experiences. Berkeley says no, Kant says yes, but in Kant's theory, the noumena is a totally incomprehensible assumption that we make that there is really a world out there. But so it's a dualism. It's a dualism between the world of our consciousness, the world of our experience, everything we do know, and this reality of the world in itself. But we can't understand it, we just assume it. Now, there are also dualistic ideas that are referred to as parallelism and epiphenomenalism. And those ideas basically imply that there are two different correlative flows of reality. There is the material flow of cause and effect, and there is the conscious flow of ideas, feelings, sensations, and emotions, and whatever. That is, each of the two realities flows along. They parallel each other, but they don't interact with each other. But how could that possibly be? And basically, what epiphenomenalism ends up saying is that Yes, there is a world of consciousness, but that world of consciousness doesn't have any impact at all on the flow of physical events. Even though, from our own experience, it feels as if our consciousness does affect the physical world. But I won't go into it in detail here. But there's going to be a real deep scientific problem with the notion that consciousness and immaterial reality can influence the material realm and have a causal effect on it. So, this is a way of getting around the interactive problem, but it leaves you with two independent correlative flows of events and no sense whatsoever of why they correlate with each other, or even though they look like they interact, they really don't. And it's a dualism. Another kind of dualism, which I think is a little interesting, is that it's the idea that the brain doesn't generate consciousness. Rather, the brain is a physical object, receives consciousness from a non local universal source. So that means that right now I'm having conscious experiences, and they're like me, a radio receiver, receiving those conscious experiences from some outside or transcendent source to my physical brain. Now, some people believe this. Consciousness doesn't come out of the brain, but it comes from some transcendent, non local source. Now, materialism and idealism are both forms of monism. Monism is the idea that there's only one single reality. The extreme form is all is one, everything is one thing. And all distinctions and separations that we see or believe that we see are illusory, unreal. And you find this idea in the ancient pre Socratic philosopher Parmenides. And you also find this idea in Hindu thinking and the notion of an all pervasive, unifying, unqualified consciousness, and that all distinctions and separations are just simply apparent but not real. I accidentally put up the Spinoza slide ahead of time, so we'll just ignore that picture for the moment. The all is one theory is a form of monism, but so are both materialism and idealism. What materialism and idealism basically do is either to say that everything is physical and consciousness isn't a separate reality. That's materialism. Or idealism, consciousness is the only thing that really exists and the physical world doesn't. So both materialism and idealism reduce everything to a one, a monism. And let me come down now to Spinoza. I already put his image of, because Spinoza is another famous monist thinker. And Spinoza, who was a 17th century philosopher who got excommunicated, notably as one of the only people in history, from the Jewish religion because his ideas offended his fellow Jewish worshippers. And Spinoza believed that there was only one substance, one thing, that's monism. Consciousness and physical matter were just two different manifestations of this single underlying reality. So when we see correspondences between consciousness and our physical bodies, that's because they're two aspects of one underlying reality that everything is a modification of, only a single substance. And Spinoza saw that single substance as fundamentally nature, but he also called it God. So Spinoza has been referred to as a pantheist in that he believed God and the universe were the same thing. God is not separate from the universe. God didn't create the universe. God is the universe. And we are all modifications, finite modifications of that single underlying reality. Um, so that's a different kind of view of monism than either materialism or Parmenides and Hinduism, all is one, or idealism. This is Spinoza's neutral monism, but it's a unifying substance underneath it all that connects everything, that everything is a modification of. And you might see in there similarities with Hindu ideas about a universal underlying reality that every particular is simply a manifestation of. And in Spinoza's mind, also, it's good to get back in tune with this underlying single reality. In Spinoza's mind, see everything through the eyes of eternity, which means basically see everything through the eyes of God, which basically means in the Eastern version, always look at the world from a perspective of cosmic consciousness. Now, I'm going to jump up to contemporary times because here is another monistic view which comes up in different forms. It's very popular. I'm going to talk about it several times here, but the first place I'm going to introduce it here is with the dual perspective or double aspect theory, the identity theory. Now, one of my professors at the University of Minnesota, Herbert Feigl, who they have an image up there, was an advocate of this view, and Feigl um, was a very interesting character, original member of the logical positivist Vienna Circle, and knew just about everybody famous in the 20th century because I would go chat with him all the time. And he was a very nice man, getting old at that time, but very willing to talk to a young graduate student. Um, and Feigl took the view that when you look at the brain from the outside, the third person perspective, or a body, it appears as a physical object. But if one takes the reverse point of view, how does the brain feel to itself from the inside? From the inside, it is consciousness. That the interior or intrinsic nature of the physical brain is consciousness. From the outside, it looks like a physical reality. From the inside, it is experienced as consciousness. So consciousness is simply the interior view of a brain. How does the brain feel to itself? From the outside, it looks physical. From the inside, it looks like consciousness. And this is the difference between the first and third person perspectives, or the subjective versus the objective. And Ken Wilber, who I'm going to talk about repeatedly as we go along, also seems to me to take this point of view too. So it's not like they're two separate things here, consciousness and the physical world. There's just two different ways of looking at it. If you look at it from the outside, it looks physical. If you experience it from the inside, and you do, if it's you, that is that physical thing, it is consciousness. But another variation on monism, which is also, I think, interesting, is Aristotle. And Aristotle rejected Plato's dualism of an eternal realm and a transitory physical realm. And Aristotle saw the psyche as the form of the physical body. So if I were to look at some structure, on one hand, I could say, well, the structure is made up out of something. It has a composition. It has um, something that is its constituent substance that it's made up out of. That's matter. If you look at the form of it, the shape of it, and in Aristotle's vision, the functional dynamics of it, that's the psyche. So the mind is the form of the body in Aristotle's thinking. It is not a separate thing from the body. It is simply the functional dynamic form of the body. To make it a little more precise, you could say that Aristotle would think consciousness is part of what the body does, but it's a verb, not a separate thing. It's the functionality of that body. So that's a monism as well too. And we're going to we'll go back to this idea again on and several other versions to come. Now, just let me give you some more on monism because monisms come in lots of different forms. A very famous 20th century physicist, David Bohm, here's a quote from David Bohm: consciousness is much more of the implicate order than is matter. Yet at a deeper level, matter and consciousness are actually inseparable and interwoven. Just as in the computer game, the player and the screen are united by participation. So matter and consciousness are intertwined together at the implicate level, and I'll come to that in a moment, in the same sense in which me and the machine are united together in their interaction with each other. Okay, so given that opening quote, let me give you some other versions of monism here. Since the development of information theory and computer theory and computers, people have started arguing that the thing that unites together consciousness and the physical world is information. That is, information conceived of as structure or pattern is the unifying feature of both consciousness and physical matter. And information, structure, differences, patterns is what is ontologically primary. So it's not physical matter, it's not consciousness, but rather it's form, it's patterns, which is primary. And pattern or form can be manifested either in a physical reality or in a conscious reality. But what's fundamental is structures and patterns and not substance. So that's one form it's another form of monism. And it's a form that does away with substance or thingness and rather substitutes form as what's primary. Now, with David Bohm presented the argument, and he's very famous for this, that at a phenomenal experiential level, existence looks like distinct entities. But at a deep level, and he's speaking as a physicist, reality is a oneness, a unity. The explicate order is the phenomenal order, it's the order of differences. The implicate order that's underneath it all is a oneness and a unity of everything together. It's all oneness. Now, in some ways, this has Platonic features to it. It has Hindu features to it. It has Spinoza features to it, but it's informed by a physicist. So basically, it's that underneath it all, there's a oneness, but in terms of what appears to us, it looks like a diversity. That's also Parmenides, too. Now, there's a fascinating monist, contemporary philosopher of mine, Max Velmans, who I've looked at over the years, and he's a bit challenging or difficult to understand. And Bruce, in fact, and I got into a bit of a discussion about Vellman's, but Vellman's is very well known and presents what sort of looks like a unique kind of monism, which, for want of better expressions, you could call phenomenological externalism and reflective monism. Now, to cut through all those words there, Vellman's believes that consciousness is the universe reflecting on itself. That is, he doesn't start from the brain or biology. He starts at this cosmic level that consciousness is the self reflection of the universe. And so each of us is a particular reflection on the universe, or it's each of us is the universe being conscious of itself from a particular differentiated structure. This sort of sounds like Leibniz. Um, Vellman also doesn't think that conscious qualities, the sweetness, the smells, the emotions, are not identical, reducible to brain states, and that in fact, Vellman believes that in the act of self reflection, we indeed are conscious of the physical universe. We see it. He's a direct realist in a sense. Um, but what we see is a uniquely perspectival experience of that physical universe. So the physical universe appears to us from a point of view in our perceptions of it. But keep in mind that we are part of the universe experiencing or reflecting on itself. And this, in ways, is similar to other ideas on consciousness. Um, I think it's sort of fascinating, and it is a bit of a challenge to try to tease out his different ideas here. But his book, Understanding Consciousness, is definitely worth looking at. Now, another guy who's rather interesting here, who in some ways is going to sound similar, but I'm going to bring him up anyway, is Yugen Nagasawa, who is I believe, a Japanese American philosopher. And Nagasawa's proposed the notion of priority monism. That is, instead of looking for the origin of consciousness at the local level of brains or nerve cells, we should look for it from the perspective of the cosmic totality of the entire universe. And that, I think, I'm pretty sure, he's arguing, stating that the cosmos is conscious prior to there being consciousness in individuals. Now, he's not saying that there's an underlying unifying primordial consciousness. Rather, he's saying that the physical universe itself, as a totality, is conscious to begin with. And our individual consciousnesses emerge out of that cosmic consciousness. Now, this is going to lead us into, because he has thoughts in connection with this as well, on another view, panpsychism. Panpsychism, as a theory of consciousness, is the idea that all physical entities, all physical realities are conscious. Consciousness is the inner state of anything that is a physical entity. This is a form of the identity theory that consciousness is looking at reality from the inside as opposed to the outside. Panpsychism is connected with the ancient view of animism that all of nature is inspirited. There's spirits in everything. And upon a moment's reflection to get an idea of what this means, panpsychism implies that rocks from the inside are conscious. Dirt is conscious. Chairs are conscious. Shit is conscious. Everything that is a physical entity, substance, from the inside is conscious. Now, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody say that? They say it because it is such a difficult challenge to figure out how consciousness could arise in the physical world out of physical matter. So why don't we just assume right at the beginning that all physical matter is simply conscious from the inside? That's what it is. And Galen Strawson, who I mentioned earlier, is a contemporary philosopher who is a panpsychist who believes that there's a primordial experiential dimension to all natural entities, and he doesn't understand how consciousness could pop into existence out of physical matter. So he just assumes that consciousness is in there from the inside to begin with in everything in different levels. So the rock isn't as conscious as you are, but the rock is conscious. There's both micro and macro panpsychism. The smallest entities possess an inner consciousness. That's micro panpsychism. That sort of sounds a little like Leibniz, too. Macro consciousness is that, or macro panpsychism is that when you take all of these individual conscious entities, each of the individual atoms, and you put them together in great complexity, you get a holistic single consciousness, which would be us, for example, as a combination of innumerable single consciousnesses. And Nagasawa seems to believe that. He believes in cosmic panpsychism. And there's a good interview with him and Robert Kuhn, What is Panpsychism, in an interesting book, God and Phenomenal Consciousness. But Nagasawa seems to believe that everything is conscious. The universe as a totality possesses consciousness, a cosmic consciousness, and that's more fundamental than individual consciousness. So this is an idea that comes up in many different forms, and you could end up calling it cosmopsychism, which is the universe somehow possesses some kind of holistic consciousness and maybe even some holistic purpose or telos. So consciousness here gets spread all over the place, from the most dumbest, simplest particles of matter to consciousness somehow being a property of the universe as a whole, and the universe is somehow conscious. Or you have, of course, Vellman's from the previous slide, where each of us is a individuated, perspectival, conscious perception the universe has of itself. So we should note here that consciousness as a topic ends up getting strongly connected together with theories about the nature of reality. That in order to understand consciousness, it somehow appears as if you understand reality as a whole. Now, I noticed that we're at 10 minutes after 12. Now, I didn't quite get as far as I wanted to, but we will continue next time because I want to at least have a little time here to talk about questions, comments, and so Terry, if you can put this on pause and stop recording, we'll continue.